Thank you. So welcome to our final Lunch and Learn session of 2023. My name is Keith Jasper. I'm the principal in charge of transportation planning and programming at MBTA. This Lunch and Learn series reflects one of the many MBTA roles identified in our transportation technology strategic plan, which was originally adopted in May of 2021 and updated in November of 2022. The Transportation Technology Strategic Plan, or TTSP, as we call it, was developed by MBTA staff in conjunction with our Transportation Technology Committee. And it looks at technologies from the perspective of whether or not they support our vision for Northern Virginia when it comes to transportation, or indeed whether there are perhaps some conflicts between technologies and our vision. The most recent update I mentioned, the November 2022 update, included a 9th strategy entitled Enhanced Mobility in the Region Through Innovation and Emerging Technologies in Transit. And so this particular session is very timely and topical to that. I believe if anyone wants to learn more about the TTSP, Griffin has posted a link to that in the chat box. Feel free to take a look at that and follow up if you have any questions. The format of this session is that we'll be targeting it to last for 45 minutes. However, as I mentioned earlier, we are recording this, and that recording will be posted on our YouTube channel, and I think we'll be sending that link out to you as fairly soon after this meeting ends. The link may come to you from Eventbrite. I'm not sure about that, but that's something to look out for. Also, this Lunch and Learn series is open to everyone. And I mean everyone. There are no restrictions other than we have a maximum number of people that the technology will allow us to involve, but there's no limitation. So we have a combination of practitioners from both the public and private sector, and citizens and others who are representing elected officials, if not elected officials themselves, all invited, all welcome. So our focus for the Lunch and Learns is on actionable innovations in transportation that could occur in the near term or are indeed already occurring. And our role here is not necessarily to fund those projects, but to inform ourselves and others in the region who are interested in these topics. Next slide, please. Just before we hand over to our guest speaker this morning, Joe Stainsby, we'd like to conduct a couple of quick polls. And if we could put the first of those polls up. Okay. So there's no right or wrong answer to any of these polls. But what we would like you to do is just let us know how you rate your understanding of microtransit concepts, from very knowledgeable to no knowledge at all, or somewhere in between. I'll just give you a few seconds to complete that poll. And when you're ready, Ian, let us know what you learned. Okay. We're all hedging here. We got a few experts, some who are looking to learn, and majority of folks kind of somewhat knowledgeable in the middle. We know something, we want to learn more. Okay, thank you for that. Now if we could go to the next poll. And here we'd like you to tell us what you perceive as the primary challenge in implementing bus microtransit in Northern Virginia, and note that in addition to the first four topics, which are kind of technical or regulatory in nature, or other kind of institutional related things, the last two options here include other, and if you respond other, then please just put something in the chat box to explain what that is. And if you don't know, it's perfectly fine to say that as well. So take a couple of seconds to give you a chance to think about that. And Ian, when you're ready, if you'd like to share those results. Okay. Infrastructure, public acceptance, and technology. No one's gone for regulatory or suggested anything else, but there may be a couple of folks who aren't sure. So interesting mix. Thank you for those responses. So with that, let's go to the next slide. I'd actually like to just hand over to Joe, who's the Chief Development Officer of the Potomac and Rappahannock Transportation Commission, otherwise known as PRTC, and today's topic, lessons learned in microtransit deployments. So Joe, over to you.
All right, thank you very much, Keith. Good morning, everybody. Season's greetings to everyone. So we can just go right ahead and go to the next slide, please. Yep, so I'm Joe Stainsby. I'm the Chief Development Officer for OmniRide, as I suspect everybody knows on the phone. I work for PRTC. We are the administrative home of OmniRide, our bus service, and also VRE, the train service, and PRTC governs them both. This slide here shows our wonderful transit centre down in Woodbridge in lovely autumnal colours, and based on the temperature today, it would be nice if it was still like that, but it is not. So I'm going to walk you down the path of two very different microtransit implementations that we have in our service footprint and lessons that we've learned from them. This is kind of my second go round at this. The first one was kind of just after we'd actually launched the service, and there really wasn't much that we could say about it one way or the other. But now that we have two very distinct zones, I think hopefully folks will be interested in what we have learned from these two different things, especially bearing in mind one of the poll questions there. Most people seem to think that one of the biggest barriers was public acceptance. Certainly that's what we have seen here, and I do have some solutions for that type of stuff. So next slide. Right, so this is basic information, so I will be brief with this, especially considering as most folks know what microtransit is, but it's very much, you know, taxi adjacent, right? So it sits between traditional fixed route and taxis, right? It is the fundamental thing, the critical point to remember is that it is on demand versus fixed route. If the demand isn't there, the trip doesn't happen. If you're looking to do this to make savings, that's where your savings are going to come from, because you don't have a big giant bus rolling around out there all the time, making stops regardless of whether or not anybody needs them. It theoretically allows you to offer for the same amount of money, a larger service footprint, potentially better headways. And I will sandbag a lot of that stuff today and say potentially and maybe and this, that, and the other, because of course it's all governed by the resources that you bring to bear in the zone, right? If you have a gigantic zone, but you only have one van, well, then the customer experience is not going to be great, right? And vice versa. So there are lots of different vendors that do microtransit. We personally chose Rideco through our relationship with Keolis, which are the company that actually directly operates our bus service. There are, you know, one of the other giant ones moving in the space is a company called VIA. They tend to focus more on like a turnkey solution, right? But our solution, we own the vehicles. They are OmniRide operators that drive the vehicles. And so it's really just a software solution that we are using Rideco for. So for the app that they use, the computer, the back end, all of that type of stuff is done through Rideco, but everything else is an OmniRide service, and it is an OmniRide branded service. Next slide, please. Again, just dovetailing off what the prior slide there are numerous advantages here. You know, extending filling gaps, replacing failing routes, both of which we have done, as we'll get to yet later. It gives you some more granular information about people who are potentially using your service, and it's just a more flexible way to interact with your service, interact with your customers. Allows you to offer wider spans of service, larger areas, better headways, all of those types of things, and can kind of bring more of an equitable approach to your service footprint. Next slide, please. One key distinction, and I really want to stress this as key, especially for those people who are worried about public acceptance, it can be very difficult to kind of wordsmith out exactly what microtransit is and how it is very much not a cab and very much not a bus, right? And they'll say, oh, so you interact with it with an app. Okay, so it's basically Uber. Well, yes and no, right? An Uber, or a Lyft for that matter, that's going to be a door-to-door service. It's a taxi. This is a corner-to-corner service. That is microtransit intention. You are going to be going from a nearby point of aggregation to a nearby point of aggregation for your destination, right? So you may have to walk 1/10 of a mile, 2/10 of a mile in very rare instances to actually get to where the vehicle is going to pick you up, right? So it does slide very much in between the fixed route and the taxi. It isn't both, right? And so some of the expectations that people will have when they're interacting with the app is because of they're very familiar with Uber and Lyft, they will expect it to pick them up from where they're standing when they request a ride and take them to exactly where they want to go, right? Now, in some cases, that will be the case, and in some cases, it won't, right? For example, if you're looking to go to Potomac Mills Mall, perhaps, we are going to have a stop that might be right by the entrance to Potomac Mills Mall, and that's fine. But if you're maybe looking to go to Manassas Town Hall, because of the one-way system that's around there, the point that we drop you off at might require you to walk 1/10 of a mile or something like that. So you have to set the expectations accordingly. Next slide, please. As I mentioned from the top, we're going to be talking about thing 1 and thing 2 today. So 2 different versions of the same story, right? So we have 2 very distinct microtransit zones, one in the eastern area of our service footprint in Manassas and Manassas Park, and one on the western side of our area in Dale City and in eastern area side of our area rather in Dale City and Dumfries, right? And they are very different both geographically speaking and also in what they do. The western side of our service area, one which came online first, was to replace a failing fixed route bus, the Manassas Park local route 68. Very low occupancy, very long headways, and we were challenged with replacing that route in a revenue neutral way and seeing what kind of improvements we could get both in terms of the service coverage area, but also in terms of the headway. On the eastern side of the area, we have a much larger zone that sees our first implementation of a public-private partnership where we work with Prince William Yellow Cab, who basically facilitate all of the rides we have that come off of the town of Quantico. I'll get to that a little bit later, but there are some geographic impediments, mostly to do with security around the Marine Corps base, that precluded us from being able to do that service ourselves. Also, blended or not, on the western side of the area, it is a blended service with our paratransit service, right, which is called OmniRide Access. So the same vehicles operate both services. And on the eastern side of our area, they currently are not blended because we still operate a deviated fixed route service on the eastern side of our service area. But that will change next year and become a blended service on the eastern area as well. So they're the same, but they're different. Next slide, please. So OmniRide Connect is simply the name of our service. What you see on your screen there in the, I guess, kind of olive drab color is the microtransit zone for Manassas Park, right? We soft launched it in December of 2022, and we ran it in parallel with the Route 68 until January, and then we eliminated it. It's a corner-to-corner service, and it's co-mingled with our paratransit. This is, you know, we also offer paratransit over there, but paratransit zone is, of course, much bigger, right? You know, the idea of this service was that for the same amount of money that we are spending on the fixed route, we were able to offer, you know, 15-minute headways instead of 45 to an hour headway, sometimes even longer than that during the middle of the day, an equal or greater span of service, and just a larger service footprint. And we were able to do that for the same amount of money that we were spending on the fixed route, okay? The very last bullet point there is something that's important to mention, is that how do people interact with this service? Because some of the pushback that we got on this service, we of course didn't get on the service on the eastern side, because of course the service on the eastern side is a complementary service. It's supplementing stuff which already exists. We didn't replace anything to make it happen, right? Whereas with this, we did. We did extensive outreach on the western side of the service area. And one of the many things that people objected to was, how are they going to interact with the service? They don't like to use their phone. Okay, well, you can also use our call center. You can also use a website. So there are other ways to interact with the service that don't involve you necessarily having to be hugely technologically savvy in order to do that. And I think that is important to maintain that, because a lot of the riders that were existing on the Route 68 were not technologically savvy, and we did have to kind of win them over. Next slide, please. So what we see here is kind of a long timeline of how we finally got this implemented, because when we initially broached it, we received a petition saying that people didn't want to do this. They didn't understand what it was. Was it a taxi? Wasn't it a taxi? So we had to do substantial levels of outreach. We, in fact, set up an outreach team called our Team 360. We spent hundreds of staff hours riding the buses. We went to farmers markets. We went to community events. We went to everybody, and well beyond what we normally do for our public outreach, which just might simply be a couple of public hearings, right? We also had listening sessions, which were a little bit less aggressive in terms of, we didn't go with a bespoke presentation. We really just kind of sat there and listened to the questions that people had. We did utility bill inserts, but as you can see there, from the middle of 2021 to basically the middle of 2022, that entire period was just winning over hearts and minds for us to be able to do this. And what we saw when we did the ride-alongs was that the ridership on the Route 68 was very much a very small nucleus of people who were riding the route basically all day, who were using it to address a concern that they had, but it wasn't a transit need. The concern and need that they had was really a place to be warm, or a place to be cold, or a place to talk to your friends. So it was a social need that they had, not necessarily a transit need. And microtransit really doesn't lend itself to that, right? It's a smaller vehicle. You're not going to be in there with a bunch of your friends at the same time, and it is point to point. You can't just ride it around in a loop. So we had to convince these people that this was going to be good for their transit need, and then work on some kind of separate tracks in order to be able to address the social services need that was currently happening on the buses over there. Next slide, please. So this moves on to the eastern side, and you can see there what we have is our lovely little transit polygon. And if you look right down in the bottom right-hand corner, you can see the town of Quantico. Okay, so that launched in 2023, this service. Functions basically exactly the same. It operates alongside our fixed route service, which currently also has the deviated fixed route, as I mentioned earlier, which is in lieu of paratransit. We do not have full paratransit on the eastern side of Prince William County, but we will as of spring of next year, and then it will operate identically as we do on the western side of the area, which is commingled. And this is a completely new service area. We have a lot of local service that goes up and down Route 1, that goes on 234, Opitz, this, that, and the other. And you will see the way that we have crafted this blob, if you will, is to include a lot of trip generators, your Targets in the top left-hand corner, your Walmarts, your Centara hospitals. And interestingly, what you see down there with the town of Quantico, they have the DBID security card situation now on basically the Quantico Marine Corps base, that precluded our operators from being able to get on, which is why we actually had to stop the fixed route bus in the first place that was going to the town of Quantico. But they are citizens of Prince William County that live there, and we wanted to try and serve them as best as possible. And so we had essentially just been doing a cab program where they called up, they booked a cab, Prince William Yellow Cab, went and provided the trip, and they could basically come out to Route 1, and then they had to mingle into the rest of our service. So what we've done there is we've upgraded the service. We continue to work with Prince William Yellow Cab. They already had a tablet in their vehicles, and we simply now have the Rideco app on their tablets. So if you are going to and from the town of Quantico, you will take that trip in a Prince William yellow cab vehicle. You will interact with the service exactly the same. It just won't be an OmniRide vehicle that shows up to deliver your service, like the ones on the background of this slide, and I believe I do have a picture later. Next slide, please. There we go, perfect. So if you're in the town of Quantico, your vehicle's going to look like the ones in the bottom right. And if you're taking a trip still within the Dumfries zone, but it's not on the town of Quantico, so you're going from, say, the Walmart to the Target, or from the hospital to the Target, or something like that, it's going to be in one of the OmniRide black branded Chrysler Voyagers that you see there in the top left, right? It has not been without hiccups in terms of it being rolled out, and you know, we are very proud of this partnership, but it has been challenging, and I've listed a couple of the bullet points there as to some of the issues that we have had. So this is a very important one. Our operators that operate our service are paid by us to be out there for a certain amount of time, and so the vehicle is always available. Prince William Yellow Cab, they work basically like independent traders. They work the hours that they want to work, they turn on the app, they turn off the app, and Prince William Yellow Cab doesn't really pay them directly. They are not directly employed. So they're basically just contractors, and they can work the hours that they want to work. And that's challenging for us because we have to ensure that there are a certain minimum, generally, of vehicles available in the zone in order to be able to provide trips at all times of day, not just desirable times of day. And so that autonomy has been challenging to deal with. One of the ways that we've sought to incent that is that we essentially guarantee that each operator will be paid a certain amount for the trip. It's not the metered rate. It's, if you're doing a trip in the program, you're getting paid, you know, $20 or something like that, right? And that means that for some very short trips, that's going to be extremely lucrative for you. And for some trips, maybe it won't be, but overall, on average, you're going to be coming out ahead. But that clarity of message has proven extremely important in order to be able to get those kind of yellow cab operators online. The last bullet point has been somewhat of a sore spot recently, in that, if you can believe it, you do have operators and passengers operating together to essentially book a short trip that that person doesn't really need to take, but they know that it's only going to cost $5, $6 to do the trip, but we might pay them $20 for the trip because that's our base rate. And so you would book the trip, and then the operator and the passenger are kind of splitting the extra on the back end, right? And so these are all things that we have had to stamp out because we cannot exert the level of control over the independent Prince William Yellow Cab operators as we can on our service, right? Now, as we are working in to potentially bring our operated service back into Quantico, it's conceivable that our partnership with Prince William Yellow Cab will decrease because of some of these pinch points, right? But as it exists right now, it is working. It does allow us to offer a better, more integrated level of service to people on the eastern side of our service area. And so we are maintaining the partnership at the current time. Next slide, please. So now we get to some of the lessons learned stuff. So I think that by and large, these apply to both of our zones. Number one, give yourself time. We did a soft launch that was invaluable, making sure that you get all of the kinks worked out. You might, if you're using traditional fixed route operators, which we were, they are oftentimes not savvy with interacting with a tablet in the vehicle and also keeping their eyes on the road. So you have to be able to manage that, right? Now, Keolis has subsequently set up an entirely different tier of operator that simply does the microtransit. And that's advantageous for them because it means that they can take people who don't have a CDL, right? Which means that their training is less, and the overall environment for transit right now, it's quite difficult to find good transit operators. So taking people who don't already have a CDL, or you have to train them to get a CDL, is advantageous. But you do have to be careful in standing that up. And the second point is basically backs that up. You also want to consider, if you are directly operating the service, that you want the vehicle the operator and the passengers to be as safe in that vehicle as they would be in one of the fixed route buses. And that means you've got to have bike racks. It also means you've got to have cameras, security and stuff in the actual vehicle, just like you do on a bus, right? And it may not be easy to install a bus system in a minivan, but we wanted to have that parity of expectation, not, oh, I'm going to be going to give a microtransit trip and we don't have cameras in that vehicle, so something terrible could happen to me and there'll never be any video of it. That's the type of stuff you have to factor in as well. Some of these other things, I won't read all of them. Make sure that you have specific SOPs. Manage trip generators. That's absolutely a big one. We have done that, and as you'll see on some of these other slides, we basically at first with the Dumfries zone, we didn't include the target because we knew that a lot of people would want to go there. We included the Walmart, but we didn't include the target so that we could manage the resources. Because if we're putting 2 or 3 vehicles out there at any given time, the only way that you have to control the quality of the experience is that ratio between how many vehicles you have out there and how many people want to interact with the service. And we're trying to guarantee that 15 minutes. And so we just simply didn't want to swamp the resources that we had, and then people end up with 45-minute, hour-long, wait times, and that's a problem for how people feel about the service. So the good news with microtransit is because you can interact with the service and you can change things on the fly, you can add in those trip generators like Centara Hospital or like the Target, and you can bump up the trips as you're looking to do that. So don't start the zone huge to begin with. Have it be small, and then you can add other people in. Better to under-promise and over-deliver, just like so much in life. And then also bear in mind that you can have service zones for major events like holiday parades, which is particularly relevant at the current time of year. Next slide, please. So I've got I don't know if anyone's familiar with Shrek, but I definitely have felt a little bit like I'm listening to Donkey from Shrek, where he's like, oh, pick me, right? Is that this has proven to be extremely popular. A lot of our elected officials would like to have this in their districts because it's the new fun thing to interact with. However, it is not a panacea. It's not going to make all of your transportation woes go away, right? It can be a solution to a problem. It can offer better headways if you have the resources. It could be cheaper, right? If you replace a fixed route bus with one van, right? But if you replace it with one van, is that going to then deliver the same quality of service? No, right? We have always been trying to do it to make the service more efficient, which is not necessarily the same as cheaper, right? Generally speaking, we pay about $50 an hour for one of our microtransit vehicles to be out there versus $150 an hour, very roughly, for one of our fixed routes. However, we don't ever only have one van out there. So if we have 2-3 vans out there, well, it's the same as the fixed route bus, but it's still able to deliver better time, better interaction with the service, and so therefore it is better, right? It is not a one-way flow to microtransit. We are not in the business of liquidating all of our fixed routes and converting them into microtransit zones, because in a great many cases, it's just not going to be appropriate. You have the passenger load that's going to be too high for microtransit. Where it works is places where you're looking to replace a route that really has terrible ridership, or where you're looking to introduce service that can potentially be a gateway to fixed route transit. So you use it as a flow-through point as opposed to a means to an end in itself. And you really have to ask that question. What do you want from a service? Do you want it to be fun to interact with and flexible, but you're not really prepared to commit the resources to have the headways be as good as they could be with fixed route? Well, then, what do you want it to be? Do you want it to be cheaper? Do you want it to be better? Because as I've said, those are not necessarily the same thing. One final point that I've learned, particularly from the western side of our service area, is where you have blended vehicles, people want specific things. So on the western side of our service area, where we offer paratransit and we also offer microtransit, most of our paratransit trips are done in large metro access type vehicles, Ford Transits, and the microtransit trips are done largely in the minivans, right? Now, they can both operate on both because they're both fully ADA equipped vehicles. However, people want certain specific vehicles, right? So my advice to anybody online considering it would be just pick one type of vehicle, right? Because some people will want the Chrysler, some people will want the Ford, and they will make it quite difficult on the paratransit side of things. They will complain if you show up in one vehicle versus the other, because one is more spacious, one's lower to the ground and easier to get into. So you just have to be prepared to anticipate those things. Fortunately, the software that we have does allow you to be able to ring fence certain vehicles for certain people. But the problem, if you do that, is that messes with the algorithm. Rideco has a spectacular algorithm, as do all of these vendors, for optimizing how they do trips and throughput and this, that, and the other. And the moment that you start hamstringing the system with, okay, well, this vehicle's right there, but you can't use it because it's a Chrysler and that person only wants the Ford Transit, then all of the optimization that you have, and therefore the savings in time and money that you have from the system, are really gone. So you just have to be very careful with those and kind of very much monitor the pick me syndrome, because people want it because it's shiny and new, but it might not solve the problem that they're particularly looking for. Next slide, please. Just some very high level statistics here. On the Route 68, this speaks to my earlier point. We don't quite have the numbers for November just yet, but we're averaging about 20 riders a day, down from 55 on the Route 68. The difference is those 20 riders a day is actually more unique riders than we had when we had 55 on the 68. It was basically 4 or 5 riders who were taking those 55 trips, right? And so we consider that a success, very much so. The Dumfries one is at 554 trips for the month of October, which is higher than Manassas, even though it's newer, but you would expect that because, again, it's a bigger zone. So underselling things, under promise, over deliver, gives you time to work out the bugs, and very much working on keeping those trip generators out until you know that you can service them reliably. And the very final point there is, some of these, a big movement in transit right now is very much true here, because ridership is down, and we can't overall tell our story entirely based on ridership, because that's not compelling. We have to look at impact, right? Who are you moving and why are you moving them, right? Impact has become key, right? And so exactly that for our Western microtransit. We are moving people specifically to and from work, grocery stores, and you can see that in the system. You are providing a transit need, and what we were providing before was definitely servicing a need, maybe a social services need, not a transit need, right? So we are able to make sure that the impact of the service that we are charged with delivering is as high as it can possibly be. Next slide. So to that earlier slide, these are some of our peak times. In Manassas Park, it's 10 a.m. and 3 p.m. So it's not really a huge amount of people going to and from work. It is a lot of seniors moving around in that zone. The zone is a lot smaller. Quantico, 2 p.m. and 5 p.m. These are the times where you have people moving around, precisely when the rest of our service isn't as robust. So it's kind of like an amorphous blob. It's moving in to fill those gaps. Our average trip time in Manassas is 7 minutes and 11 minutes at Quantico. Almost certainly the difference there is because the zone is bigger, but also because so many of those trips in Quantico are coming from the town of Quantico, and it takes you almost 10 minutes to get from the town of Quantico to the gate of the Marine Corps base of Quantico, right? So you're going to have an outsized number of trips that are very long just before you can get anywhere. And that also equates to the same trip length, which is 3 miles in Manassas and 5 miles in Quantico. The Manassas, our top location, is a Mega Mart, which is a relatively low-cost grocery store in Manassas. And at Quantico, the top location is the Walmart, rapidly followed by Centara Hospital, and then also the Target, right? And that's why we added those in later, because we do want to be able to manage how many hundreds of people are interacting with the service, so that we can preserve, that that expectation of trip time, right? Because we do not have infinite amounts of assets. In any area, we have 2 or 3 vehicles deployed in the field, and we have 1 vehicle in reserve in either location, either time. Obviously, all of our Manassas vehicles are operated out of our Western Service facility over off Balls Ford Road, and all the ones on the eastern side are operated out of the Woodbridge facility where I'm speaking to you from right now. And so we do not have the ability to just be able to dump huge amounts of extra vehicles into those service areas if we need to. So we do have to manage those trip generators. Next slide, please. Oh, okay. I guess that's it for me. So I think we're doing relatively okay. I'm happy to take some questions. If you want, Keith, or whoever, we did receive a couple of questions in advance, so I'm happy to address those now if you'd like.
Thanks so much, Joe. Just before you do that, we'd just like to put up a couple more quick polls, and that may help you in kind of reacting to some of the responses that we get. So if we could put up the first of these 2 polls, which aspect of microtransit would be most beneficial to your jurisdiction, your agency, your area? Dynamic routing, on-demand scheduling, first-class mile solutions, integration with existing transit systems, demand responsive pricing, or something else. And if it is other, please put that in the chat box, or if you're not sure, you don't know, then the last option is probably for you. So why don't you go ahead and give us your responses now? And Ian, when you're ready, if you want to put up the results. Okay. So quite a spread of things there, Joe, to think about. And then just finally, before we move to Q&A, if we could put up the final poll. And here we're asking for you to give us a perspective as to whether you see potential value in incorporating your expanding existing microtransit services in your jurisdiction or agency, from yes, definitely at the top, to no, it's good as it is in the penultimate option, or don't know as the last option. So please take a moment to give us a reaction on that. And Ian, the results. Okay. Well, definitely got some interest there, Joe. Yes, definitely, or somewhat between there and somewhat. So that's great. Why don't you go ahead and respond to those 3 questions we got ahead of time?
All right, wonderful. All right, so I'm going to read a little bit from notes, because I did have the advantage of being able to look at some of these in first. The first question was, what types of trip demand are you seeing to from VRE stations in the area, if at all? Are most people using the service as a first last mile solution, or is their primary mode of transportation for that trip? Honestly, some of that, we don't gather that information, so it's difficult to say. But in Manassas Park, our microtransit replaced the entire fixed route. So its trip purposes are more varied. We do see people going to locations within the zone, and they would have used a fixed route bus for. VRE utilization is low, and that really wasn't what we set the service up for. The core times that people who use the microtransit zone are those 10 a.m., 3 p.m., which makes sense because, again, it's a very senior populated area, and those are the people who tend to be using the service out there. One of the largest destinations in that zone is our Megamart grocery store. And in Quantico Dumfries, there is some usage and increased usage to connect to the 234 commuter lot. But since residents in Quantico have no transportation alternatives at all due to its location, they're using the service to access critical shops, healthcare, that type of stuff, and then to connect into our local bus. In both cases, it's very much that this service is doing exactly what it should be doing. It's not a one-dimensional service that serves commuters or whatever. It's doing multiple types of transit. 2, do you have any recommendations for small/underserved communities should consider if they are considering launching microtransit as their first/only transit offering? Yeah, the first thing I would very much caution the small and underserved, because those can be two, very much rural and underserved can be two very different things, right? I think in rural areas, microtransit can be very challenging. You don't have sidewalks, you don't have lighting, you don't have natural points of aggregation, and it can be very difficult to implement there. Also the cell service, but in underserved areas, yeah, it can certainly be very useful. So you can have an underserved community inside a more urban environment. So if you want to connect them to nearby transit, or some centralized location within a relatively small zone, it should be done in a way where you have access technology, meaning they need to have Wi-Fi access, cell phone access, and they can work through hubs. Finally, the third question we received before, what do you think is the feasibility of reasonably priced public transportation other than Uber taxis within a 10-mile radius of Dulles Airport? So my initial thought is, isn't that what the Silver Line is for? And then also kind of 10 miles is a huge area. And I think maybe if you used some of you've got to build it off hubs, right? We have service corridor hubs, arterials on the eastern side with Route 1, and that's what our microtransit hooks into there. And over on the western side, we have our western hub, which is over at the courthouse, and that is inside the microtransit zone. So you have to make sure your zones go with hubs. So maybe if you use some of the metro stations potentially as hubs, and you can feed into that and have zones off that, but like that area, the amount of people that are interacting with the service, both to and from the airport or for work or whatever, inside a zone of that size, it's kind of prohibitively too large, I would think, for microtransit. And so probably, for the airport, Uber and Lyft is probably the way to go to get a one-seat ride, as many as like 10 miles out. That's it for the pre-prepared questions, Keith.
Okay, great. And just as a follow-on to that question regarding Dulles kind of focus service, the vehicles that you use were some to show up with a couple of suitcases or a lot of shopping. How's that work within the vehicles? Are they designed for a lot of baggage?
See, it's an interesting scenario there, and for shopping and for bags and this, that, and the other, yes, it would work totally fine. You're able to set the capacity of the vehicle. Like for example, the minivans technically have a capacity of 7, but we set that as a max of 4. Right, to account for people's baggage. And fortunately is because it's a minivan, it also has a bespoke trunk where you can put stuff in and it doesn't just roll around all over the place, which is a notable problem with a transit, right? Because not only in our particular configuration of the transit is the lift in the rear of the vehicle, it has no bespoke trunk, right? So you're having to put bags and groceries and stuff just down at your feet. And if you don't hold on to them because it's an industrial interior and it's hard and slippy, those things will get away from you quick in that vehicle, right? So there are situations where, depending on the type of vehicle that you choose, it's less than optimal for doing, groceries and this, that, and the other. The minivans, it's worth mentioning, the ramp and so on and so forth folds out of the sliding door on the side, as opposed to out of the rear of the van, which we have in the Transits. Now, you can get the Transit configured with a side load door, and you can do all kinds of stuff like that, but it does make access and egress, different on some of these vehicles, but it wouldn't be a problem for us, for people interacting with the service that way. But I would imagine that those people will be better catered for using some of the minivans, but the minivans tend to do, 75 to 85% of our microtransit trips anyway. And it's only under like extreme pressure that you yank in a Ford Transit anyway, right? Because almost all the time they're doing OmniRide Access, which is our paratransit service, right? So most of the time it's not an issue.
Okay, thanks. Griffin, I think we've got a question in the chat box.
Sure, we have one question in the chat box. How do you handle the safety of children under the age of 8 that generally ride in car seats in minivans, but wouldn't necessarily need a car seat on a fixed route bus?
All right, so that's an excellent question, and we have absolutely and completely and utterly punted on it at the current time, right? And we've punted on that by saying that basically the only people who are allowed to use our service at the current time are essentially adults, right? So it's 18 and over to use the service. We do not have people who are looking to put their children in the vehicle or anything like that, because that's not something that we have squared away within our SOPs at this current time. So I'm aware that that's a complete cop-out, but that is the situation as it currently stands. And one thing that I did see mentioned earlier, or that people had concerns about, were fares and charging for it and this, that, and the other. It's also worth mentioning that at the current time, in both zones, we do not charge fares, right? So our microtransit zones are considered local transit, local trips, and our local trips, all of our local buses are currently free and have been since about 6 months into the pandemic. And so as a consequence of that, we do not collect fares on either of them, so I can't really give anybody any feedback on what's a reasonable fare or fare collection techniques or something like that. Obviously, the piece of software that we use called Rideco certainly has fare collection built into it, and we would never ever have fare boxes in the vehicles. It would be all electronic payment. And that can be integrated as and when we need to do that, but we are in a fare-free environment.
And Joe, if you have time for one more question in the
course.
chat box. Okay, we got one more. Are you familiar with any microtransit systems being utilized to deliver things like medications?
That's a good question. I mean, I am not aware of that. I mean, I think that kind of would impinge fairly heavily on like the medical transportation field, and so you might kind of rub some people the wrong way with that. But the short answer is no. I am not aware of that.
And I have a question personally. Thanks
Sure.
again for your presentation. Very informative. My question is, how have you measured the success of the replacement of the Route 68 in terms of service utilization? So I guess how do you kind of know quantitatively or qualitatively whether this replacement is successful or not?
Well, so the way that we ascertained the baseline was by spending all of those hundreds of hours riding the Route 68 in the first place, and we saw the number of people that were riding it and how frequently they were riding it, and we knew that the new microtransit service was going to essentially dissolve that ridership behavior, for better or worse, right? And certainly for those people, it was worse. They came to our listening sessions and this, that, and the other, and we tried to work with them as best as possible. But when the trip is the purpose, there isn't a purpose to the trip. Microtransit is quite difficult, right? So if you're just looking for essentially a mobile living room, right, well, then that's not going to work for microtransit, and exposes kind of a more acute social services need there. So when we were seeing that really you're only getting about 4 or 5 people with the Route 68 who are actually using the service on a daily basis, it might be 50 to 60 trips, but it's only 4 or 5 people. We now know with microtransit, right, that we have like over the course of a month, we might have 40 to 50 different people who are actually availing themselves of the service with varying levels of frequency. That's what we consider to be a success, right? Because we were able to make the footprint of the service area that much larger and the trip times that much less, so more people are using the service, right? And that was what the goal was. And so that's how we are able to judge that. There's a slight sidebar to that. There's something that you need to be prepared for with microtransit, and we're a mid-sized transit agency at best, is that the amount of data that you get generated from these programs is absolutely mind-boggling. So Rideco produces us, lists of, wait times and dwell times and how long it took people to respond, and, top 10 lists for where people are most like to go and where they least like to go. So we could have an entire person who their only job was adjusting the microtransit zone, right? And we don't have the ability to have that, but And I think we were somewhat taken aback by just the sheer volume of data that these programs can generate. So insofar as folks are able to anticipate that and maybe carve out a substantial portion of someone in the planning team's time to be able to really marshal that, I think the better off they'll be.
Awesome. Thanks a lot, Joe.
No, my pleasure.
Great. Well, thank you so much for the questions and Joe for your responses. I'd just like to wrap up with one of my own just quickly. Question we love to ask at this time of year is looking ahead to the new year and maybe a year or two beyond that. Do you see any obvious evolutions in the microtransit service within your service area?
Yes, yeah, we do. I mean, to go back to my kind of donkey slide, I mean, we're in the process of kind of basically beating people off with a stick as nicely as possible, right? Because everybody wants it, and we need to put it in where it's going to be complementary. I mean, so places like North Woodbridge, like as you just go right over the bridge from Lawton and you come in, they're doing a lot. The county's doing a lot of transit-orientated development there. So it's possible that we would put a microtransit zone there. Also, I'm speaking to you from the extremely glamorous location of our transit center, which when it was put here in the 90s was put here precisely so that nobody could see it. So it isn't near anything, right? But there is currently construction on the Neabsco commuter garage over by the Wegmans at Stonebridge, for those folks who are familiar with Woodbridge. And when that is open, which is meant to be next year, probably maybe the year after, we are looking at moving a lot of our local service over to that area, and we will make adjustments to our Eastern Microtransit service zone to incorporate that area. Because right now, the transit center is not part of our microtransit, right? Microtransit zone. But once it moves over there, we can look at expanding it. It can be part of the hub, and then that it's even more integrated into our service, right? So those are some of the changes that we are looking at. But I think that going forward for us, we will probably not be eliminating any routes to put in a microtransit zone. The only use case scenarios that we are going to have going forward are where we want to basically assess for 6 months or a year the interest in transit in a particular area, Potomac Shores or something like that, right? We want to put in a zone, see what use people have for it, and then determine whether or not you want to leave the microtransit zone, or maybe you want to put in a fixed route. So I think that's how we will be using it in the coming year and 2 years beyond. Okay, fantastic. Well, I think I'm right in saying you are our first repeat speaker for this Lunch and Learn program, and I think with that response, it's highly likely you're going to be getting a third invite in the next year. So we look forward to that. I think we should just wrap up here. We go quickly to the next slide. Our next session, which was previously advertised for January 4th or 5th, we've decided that it makes a lot more sense to not hold that in the first week back after the holidays. So we've moved this next session to February 1st. I hope that works for everyone, and it should be a fascinating conversation again with Paul Statkowski from VDOT Central Office, educating us on providing insights on how to prepare projects to adapt to innovation. I think that will be a very timely session for those of us, particularly on the public sector side. Next slide, which I think is our final slide. We'll leave this up for a moment. If you would like to connect with MBTA, just take a photo of that QR code and you'll arrive at our contact page, and we'll be happy to follow up with you there or individually if you already have our contact information. So with that, I'd like to once more thank Joe for his presentation this morning, all the preparation that he's put into this, and the fact that he's missing an important meeting to be with us. And to everyone else, I wish you all happy holidays and see you again for the next session in February 1st. Thanks, everyone. Thank you, everybody.